we pay tribute in solidarity with the victims of the flash floods in Nepal. Okay, a minute of solidarity. In the 80s, we started meeting here. We called ourselves Odisha Gabeshana Chakra. And when the key person, Vijay Bohidar, he moved back to Odisha. He had come here for his PhD. He moved back to Odisha. Then he and some others, they decided that we should locate it in Odisha and start discussing Odisha issues through various seminars. So from 94, it has been active. And the 33rd conference will be held next January, but 32nd was held in Balangir. We call it Balangir the capital of Dadan labor. We are going to discuss Dadan labor a lot this afternoon. Every year we take up an issue and then there are papers, and this is a platform, an initiative of scholars, social science scholars and activists, journalists, some bureaucrats, retired bureaucrats and so on. And every year we meet in some place. Last year it was in Balangir. Next year it is in Rayagada. Rayagada is in the news because of the mines and people's resistance next January. So that is about Gabeshana Chakra, and several publications have come. A few books, but this book I think will be the most, well, there was one other book. I should be equally, I should be fair to that book also. 5 years ago, the feminist leaders of Gabeshana Chakra, Swarnamayee Tripathy, Mohanty and Asha Hans, they and Amrita Patel, she is no more. So 4 of them published some gender issue related, mostly fieldwork based papers. It's called Women Reinventing Development. It was published by Akar and also by Routledge soon after. And after that, we took up this initiative. Very briefly, and the main brain behind this project is Deepak Mishra. He will tell more about it. We started having online discussions during COVID and made it a weekly Saturday reporting and discussion session for more than a year, and monitoring the movement of Odia workers from different parts of the country to Odisha. And it was a revealing experience for all the participants every Saturday. So in that process, we decided that we should now take it up as a serious project, and some 20 of us got engaged in various aspects, and we also became part of several other initiatives. I think the most important initiative some of these scholars took, most importantly Ravi Srivastava, and Kalpana Kanaviran, Asha Hans, Pushpendra and myself, we edited a book during COVID itself, also on the same issue. And then this process went on. Several field studies were going on, and you will see, and Deepak will tell more about the book. And today we are so privileged to have such a distinguished panel. We are a small initiative, Gabeshana Chakra, no money initiative with big ideas and some sincere people, that's all. And so we always say that intellectual resource and solidarity are the two great resources with which we have managed Gabeshana Chakra for the last 40 years, among some other initiatives. Many of you know. So to discuss the book, we are very proud of this book. I must compliment Deepak and Swarna, and they really worked hard. And so many scholars, Irudaya Rajan, Indrani Majumdar, and several others, they joined this project. So I'm most grateful. And today we are so privileged that Ravi Srivastava, I would say the topmost authority on this subject, and a member of, you remember, the young people should remember, he was a member of the Unorganized Workers Commission, I think it was, or committee, and that was a historic intervention on this issue. We have, and of his contributions in labor studies, everybody knows. Atul, Sood, another economist, JNU economist also, and whose work, some of the seminal papers on this subject between capital and labor in the global economic context, he has authored. We are so happy he is here. Dr. Neetha, another feminist scholar, and in this volume we have several essays, two directly addressing, but several other essays on this issue. So we are very privileged that Professor Neetha is here. Gautam Mody is a legend by himself, the General Secretary of National NTUI, National Trade Union Initiative. Biswajit Mohanty, a member of the Gabeshana Chakra, and his work is also on migration, but he has not contributed to this book. He has contributed to many other things, and he is part of the CRG, Calcutta Research Group, Migration and Migrant Labor Studies. And he has several papers to his credit on this issue, including several on Odisha. So we are so privileged to have a very eminent panel to discuss this book. Once again, a very warm welcome to all of you and several distinguished people in the audience. Thank you. Oh, now we have to release the book. Yes. And hold the book. Hold the book. Deepak.
Esteemed Chair of the meeting, Professor Mohanty, distinguished panelists, dear colleagues, friends, and my dear students, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege to welcome you all to this event to discuss this book, Workers on the Road, and this India story from Odisha. As Professor Manoranjan Mohanty has already pointed out, although our name features as editors of this book, this was a broader collective, including Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, Professor Vidyut Mohanty, Professor Asa Hans, Professor Vijay Bheda, and many more, who together conceptualized this venture. And it emerged from a series of online discussion during the COVID period, COVID pandemic. And we were listening not just to scholars, we were listening every week to the sufferings, to the despair, distress, and hope-filled stories of migrant laborers themselves, development activists, political activists who were trying to intervene, panchayat leaders, and students who were on the ground trying to intervene in the difficult situation that people in general were facing. And while listening to these narratives, very soon we realized that we are listening not just to the unfolding dynamics of sufferings because of COVID, rather it was a story, larger story of the development process that we have experienced in this country. And of course, we realized that we need to document this, analyze this. One of the early interventions was in fact led by students largely from JNU and from other universities who were stuck in their villages. And they started documenting whatever was happening around them. That came out as a report, Surviving the Pandemic, Stories from India's Villages, which was published by Development Research Institute later. During the COVID pandemic itself, we also published a kind of framework, a policy framework, collectively drawing upon these insights to the Government of India, addressed to the Government of India and the Government of Odisha specifically. That has been included in this book as well as one of the as an appendix. So it has been a collective learning experience, and rather than focusing on the pandemic as an isolated, unprecedented event, as many those who are in this room have already done so in different ways, we have tried to see the structural historical processes that generated these outcomes. So we have chapters here which talk about the historical development of Odisha, about the development of the extractive economy, about the migration process from a historical perspective. It is a book which is also inspired by the idea that a regional framing often tells us something about the development process which is missed out when we look at the development process in aggregative terms. So it is from the margin, from the perspective of Odisha, that we are trying to say something about the story of development in India. Obviously, it is not comprehensive enough, but at the same time, it brings in new insights when we scrutinize the development process from the margin. And Odisha, please, all of you will remember, is not only projected as a classic neoliberal success story, but is also a state which is a migrant sending state, and some of these migration flows are characterized by distress and labor bondage. The third thing about this book was that it was a book which puts labor at the center of our understanding. So it's a commentary on the development process of the process of labor migration from a grassroots perspective on labor. So we have one chapter by Professor Rajan and others on based on the Odisha Development Survey to 2023. We have several chapters that question the available secondary data, engage with it, and also draw on primary survey. Issues of caste, class, ethnicity, and gender are intertwined with all these different narratives. Of course, our contributors speak in different voices, speak from different vantage points. Their ideological and theoretical entry points are different, but then it was a collective effort, and personally it has been a great learning experience for me. We have an eminent panel. In fact, these panelists have contributed much to our understanding of labor and migration in contemporary India. So rather than summarizing the book, I would like to listen to our panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much on that. And the anti-labor perspective, which has been there with the earlier regimes also, has reached a very climatic point with the labor codes and this judgment. And when we discuss this book, as Deepak said, from a vantage point of utmost precarity of labor, I think you could not conceive any greater precarity of labor than the labor that we are discussing in this book, and more discussions took place in Balangir a few months ago. Therefore, I think this enterprise is historically and politically extremely important. So with these words, I now invite Professor Ravi Srivastava to begin the discussion.
This is a book, as you said, it's a huge enterprise. More than 450 pages as I read it in soft copy, 15 plus articles, and covering a huge terrain, covering a large terrain. Although the book was motivated by the workers on the road, which is the title, who returned to Odisha during the COVID-19 period, it actually is a lot more than that. It goes into the genesis of migration, of labor migration from Odisha, your contribution on the extravagant nature of production in Odisha and how it changed during the colonial period, how it affected different regions of the state and different domains stands out. But in general, we have a lot in this, which basically Professor Bidut Mohanty's own article, which goes back to the 1880s and till the 1920s. So a lot in this is about the genesis of migration. And the genesis of migration, as you rightly pointed out, intertwined with gender issues, intertwined with class issues, intertwined very, very strongly with regional issues. The regional dimension of Odia migration is a very strong dimension, and one sees that streams of migration from Odisha, from different parts of Odisha, have a very distinctive identity, a distinctive role. Bolagir has already been mentioned, but a lot of, for example, the migration which takes place to Gujarat is again from one of the coastal districts, and the Irude Rajan's own article and other articles highlight the fact that although the southwestern part of Odisha has been a major reservoir of out migrants, but the southern and central coastal regions, actually the incidence of migration, of labor migration itself is very high. Although probably the distress features in the labor migration from these regions are not as strong as they are from the KBK regions. This, basically bringing out the contours of migration is a very strong feature of the book throughout the colonial period and how the colonial period shaped migration. From then on, we come to the second part of the book, which talks about the migrants on the road during COVID-19. And this is a story with which I wondered when I was reading those parts, whether the story is very distinctive as between Odisha and Bihar and UP and other states, because the features are really very common. The features of distress as migrant workers, lost livelihoods, as they lost access to food, access to any kind of housing, and as they trudged back under whatever circumstances were available to their homes in Odisha. So this is something which one finds common, sometimes several hundred kilometers, sometimes even thousands of kilometers, using whatever means was available to them. So now I think beyond the descriptive part, beyond looking at this, the descriptive part of how migrants trudged back to their homes, is the question of precarity and vulnerability. Because this highlights how precarious these groups of workers, these migrant workers, were in the settings in which they worked. And one thing which stands out is that even in the settings in which these workers were working, the precarity extended, not only to the brick kiln workers, not only to the construction workers, but it extended even to workers who were part of manufacturing, who were part of the service sector, sanitation, other parts of the service economy. So basically, the informality and the precarity which was exhibited during COVID was very extensive. And for the first time, I think people experienced the enormous vulnerability of working people in India through the lives of migrants who were trudging back to their home states. I think the third part of the book, and here the experiences were of course different, experiences between men, women, and also children. So that is of course another part of it, and I'll say a little more about it a little later. The third part of the book deals with how Odisha as a welfare state dealt with the crisis of workers coming back to Odisha. And we have a number of articles which deal with how the quarantine centers were set up, how the health centers functioned, the ASHA workers and the burden on the ASHA workers during this whole period, the attempt by the Odisha government to provide some kind of livelihood through Manrega. But these attempts, the upskilling of workers who were returning, maintaining a directory of these workers and upskilling them. But these entire set of initiatives collapsed within the first few months itself. So beyond September, October 2020, you hardly find these moves extending themselves. I think the last part of the book, as I see it, is basically how quickly, once COVID receded somewhat by about September 2020, in fact, that was the peak period, or rather the period in which the COVID incidence was the lowest in 2020 before it rose its head again in 2021. But how quickly labor was compelled to reintegrate in the larger labor market. So you see that if there was any hope at all that the vulnerability and the precarity which was being seen by civil society, by governments, by other people, would lead to some degree of improvement in the status and bargaining power of workers, we find none of this in the post-2020 period after September, October. And we find, because of lack of alternative sources of livelihood, we find workers quickly integrating themselves back into the labor markets from where the interstices of the labor market from where they were working before COVID. And with hardly any qualitative difference. So the same Dadan experience, the same experience with debt, the same experience of escaping, escaping from Odisha with debt, or integrating into the larger labor market in Gujarat or in the construction sector in different parts of the country. But basically, very much the same experience with very little difference. The difference that occurred, and this is my last point I wish to make, is that the response, the larger term response of the state, in fact, which appeared, for example, in Indrani's article and their fieldwork, was for the state to reinstate skilling as a way of integrating the workforce in Odisha, particularly the female workforce, in the larger national manufacturing workforce. So here you find that unlike the spontaneous, or not so spontaneous, because of course there were all kinds of intermediaries in the process by which laborers and migrant laborers integrated themselves into the labor market up to the period of COVID, what you find is a renewed effort by state to skill workers and to still particularly young female workers, and then to insert them in the manufacturing economy in southern states. And the conditions under which these workers worked in the factories as informal workers, very often trying to escape those conditions and coming back to Odisha. So basically, the renewed effort by the state to actually re-engineer migration of young female workers, and this emerged as a new phenomena over this period. So basically, one of the things that this book demonstrates is that you need fundamental changes in the bargaining power between labor and capital if at all things have to change. And as Professor Mohanty pointed out, actually the last few years, particularly the years since the middle of the 2000s, 2015 onwards, have seen a balance, a tilt in the balance of forces between labor and capital in favor of capital, a much stronger of this thing. And this has occurred in newer ways than what was seen earlier. So this has also occurred as an attack on civil society more generally, whether in the form of CA or in the form of SAR that we now see. So basically, we find a very broad-ranging attack on the working class happening. And what we saw during COVID was a manifestation of the precarity, but also a manifestation of this attack which has been happening on the working class in the country. So I stop here.
Thank you very much.
One, as Professor Mohanty's and Deepak's and Professor Ravi Srivastava's elaboration about the book suggests, this is a book about Odisha, and it looks at the complex labor processes and labor conditions in Odisha, about which the depth of understanding that is available in this room, I'm fairly incompetent to comment upon. And therefore, I have a fair degree of hesitation to reflect on this book. I also have another hesitation, another reason of not to say much about this book is primarily because the contributors of this books are friends, colleagues, fellow travelers, as well as one amongst them is someone who's inspired us, Professor Manoranjan Mohanty. And therefore, it's really a challenging task for me to comment on this book. With those caveats in mind, I will offer a couple of observations about this book. This book is of immense contemporary relevance because it compels us to confront with one of the most defining questions of our time. And we don't have to go, way back. 12, 13 days ago, Maharashtra has made a working knowledge of Marathi mandatory for the commercial passenger vehicle drivers, of auto rickshaw drivers, taxi drivers, and app-based cab operators in Maharashtra. So this raises a crucial question: how do we defend labor rights, particularly rights of the migrants, when the state itself has become a participant in the anti-migrant mobilization? And that's a bigger challenge that this book actually also opens up. If you look at page 33, the book poses exactly this question. It says that at a time when nativist politics, linguistic and religious chauvinism, and racial discrimination are fueling anti-migrant sentiments, how can struggles for labor rights and migrant rights be effectively advanced? It's exactly the question that we experienced today, just 12, 13 days ago, which the book has already sort of opened up for us. This idea of the relationship between citizenship rights and migrant rights is further reinforced by the authors when they elaborate on the framework of the book. For the authors, migrant rights include set of citizenship rights, and for the authors, and rightly so. Consequently, the focus in the book is not only on the rights guaranteed by the state, but also on the social, and I will add political, processes that create barriers to access better livelihoods, enhanced livelihoods, and freedoms. So here there is a connect between migrant rights and citizenship rights, and the book, as I said earlier, opens up this question for us to think. The subtitle of the book is quite revealing. It says the India story from Odisha. So it tells us everything that, the point that Deepak elaborated and Professor Ravi Srivastava elaborated, the connect between the larger labor processes in this country and the experiences of labor conditions and the outcomes for labor in Odisha. These are extremely well elaborated in the book. Since I have a limitation in not being able to say much about the processes and the historicity of labor and labor processes and conditions in Odisha, I will restrict my observations in the next 7 or 8 minutes to the larger question of migrant labor or labor in general, and skip making any comment on the rich tapestry of labor processes and labor conditions of the state that the book weaves. My observations are made keeping two things in mind. A, how do we support the struggles which are visible today and uncovering a broken system, the struggle of the labor? Second, how might we as labor studies people assist the difficult project of organizing? These are the two questions which motivate my response to this book. I do this within the spirit of the book, and I quote from one of the sentences: the arguments presented in the volume should be seen as a part of a collective dialogue on a critical issue facing contemporary India. So whatever critical observations I'm going to make are part of this dialogue amongst us as a collective, which are concerned about labor issues and labor conditions in this country, and also share this vantage point of contributing to the difficult project of organizing labor as or resistance of labor to these precarious, vulnerable labor conditions that we are experiencing. The way forward of to the book, and as Professor Mohanty said, is presented in the appendix of the book in the section called Rights of Migrant Workers. It's a DRI statement, a framework on looking at the larger question of migrant rights or labor rights, and what kind of interventions and interjections we are seeking from the state in order to achieve this. This appendix lists both immediate, medium, and long-term measures to build, and I need to quote a few things, to build a decentralized, labor-centric, inclusive, and sustainable development model. The statement says that since rights are claimed primarily from the state, the efficiency and capacity of the state has to be improved. Page 443. The wish list from the state, as we seek in this list, include decentralized federal structure, more public expenditure on health, food security, cash transfers, NREGA, legal rights to migrant workers, improving the information base, increasing productivity in agriculture, improving agro-processing, rural infrastructure, strengthening land and forest rights, energizing the non-farm economy, strengthening SMSEs, and last but not the least, organize migrant labor. And this is where my story starts. I wonder why the last in the list is not the sole focus of scholarship, which is to organize the migrant labor. If not, then this wish list, and I ask you to reflect, is it distinctly different from the activities that the state peddles on an everyday basis to us, to the media, and the larger country in general? How do we get our distinct identity as scholars on labor studies to contribute to this last in the list is to organize labor? This concern of mine is actually a bit broad-based. It arises not only from the book, but is also based on reading a fair bit of literature that the labor studies as a field of inquiry has generated in India over the last many decades. Over the last 2 to 3 decades, the dominant output of labor studies in India has been taxonomic, endless refinement of categories: migration, circular, seasonal, distress-driven, footloose, short duration, long duration, employment status, organized, unorganized, formal, informal within formal, work arrangements, casual, contract, fixed term, gig, platform, self-employed in disguise. Each category spawns its own literature, its own survey instrument, its own policy carve-out. This is not a neutral description. From my point of view, it is where the discipline's energy has gone instead of somewhere else. More specifically, not in supporting the labor movement to build the much-needed labor resistance. Categorization is legible to the state and to the development agencies. Type frameworks reward finer classification. It reads as rigorous, empirical, apolitical. It produces policy that looks responsive, a scheme for this category, a board for that one, without anyone having to answer the harder question of why the categories keep multiplying and keep hardening. In short, measurement to me becomes a substitute for systemic explanation and building resistance. All of us talk about deeper explanation, as the book does, the links with the macro process, but then we end up asking for interventions around the categories created by the policy itself, as the book does too: cash transfers, registration, information base, decentralization, more humane policy. Categories created by the state becomes the criteria for our response. Is this the best that our scholarship can deliver? I dare ask today. When the discipline asks which category does this worker fall into and seeks intervention of the state around that category, it has already accepted the terrain that the state and capital have set for us. Categorization has become, unintentionally or not, a way of managing the crisis rather than naming it. The recent workers' protest in Noida, Manesar, has taught us the same lesson. The workers have told us loud and clear how unhelpful our collective scholarship is to them. We missed raising the core issues that they raised. Minimum wages, the way the workers crafted it. We missed making the connections between the sector workers, domestic workers, informal workers, temporary workers, permanent workers, and whatnot. We missed doing a scholarship that could be helpful to 40,000 workers who came out on the streets in the month of April just in Noida itself. I struggle myself and struggle till date to provide any meaningful support to the workers in Noida through our research. We failed to do an open, informed debate with the mainstream unions on how skipping the informal contractual workers in union building is a bad idea. We miss seeing their resistance potential along with the big unions. And as collective working on labor studies, I thought that I should raise this larger issue, which comes from the book, but also from the larger set of labor studies. The second issue that the book raises, on which I wish to say something, is the question of relationship between citizenship rights and labor rights or migrant rights. I wish to suggest today that we slightly reframe this question and see if that benefits our cause, the cause that I have just elaborated earlier. I suggest we ask, what is the connect between the larger political project that is unfolding in this country, namely to build a Hindu fascist state, and how the labor is entangled in this project? Put this way, the issue that the key that confronts us becomes suddenly very different. The question that we might then ask is, and which Professor Ravi Srivastava was alluding to in the last part of his observations, that the labor in 1920s, how is it differently located in the state's project compared to the neoliberal turn of the early 1990s? So I'm asking us to reflect that within the neoliberal framework, how is the state engaging with the labor in its early turn of the 1990s and in the 2020s? The answer to me for this question is yes, there is a major rupture in the way the state is engaging with labor. The discourse on labor has moved away from the neoliberal rights to a specific kind of a paternalistic welfare. The idea of a welfare state has itself been reframed. Contemporary welfarist intervention is conceptualized very differently, both in terms of how welfare is related with development and how it constructs the idea of welfare outside rights and entitlements. If this reading of mine is correct, then the Indian state is no longer the developmentalist state of the kind we have been used to dealing with since independence and also since the early 1990s. The list of right of workers that is appended at the end of the book that we talk into need to be revisited in this light, in the context of the question I've asked. Now, what difference will this make, what I've just said? What difference the reframing that I have said, that how labor is embedded in the authoritarian project of contemporary Indian state, why would that lead to make a difference in asking this question? We all know, and Professor Mohanty has so well put in his observation in the last chapter of the book, what happened in 2020. Out of 22 schemes launched to deal with COVID-19, only 4 dealt with labor. I'm not elaborating which ones. In the phase when India had the highest unemployment rates and the biggest wage losses, nothing was done to compensate the workers either in the organized or the unorganized sector for their wage loss or for the loss of their benefits earned during the COVID period. The state, in other words, continued with the business as usual, with further privatization of state assets, relaxation of regulations relating to land, labor, environment, suppression of democratic rights, and crackdown on dissent. Ravi mentioned about this. This is the same period when we have the labor bills. This is the same period when we have the agriculture laws. This is the same period when we have CAA. This is the same period when we have NRC. As one would have expected, Professor Mohanty has noted down all of this in the last segment of the book, as I said. He talks about the experience of COVID, how it has further legitimized the centralization of power. And there's a fair bit of elaboration in that section. The way forward, as Professor Mohanty also says in the book and in the concluding part and in the observation today, is for him also in the DRI statement, which seeks to strengthen the state. The DRI's own statement makes this former claim that the rights are in relation to the state, and therefore strengthening the state is the way forward to addressing the question of labor rights and migrant rights. The consequence of this, as I read it, is that the authors miss an important noticeable change. Change in the way the state is engaging with the citizen, especially the laboring citizens. Even the neoliberal rights of the early phase of economic reforms, which were introduced when these sectors were themselves taken out of public control, are no longer pursued in the last decade or so. The state can now be seen as the one taking away rights. The engagement of the state with the people is now outside a rights-based framework. If my framing is correct, then the real issue is not how, after COVID experience, government has not made any policy for migrant labor, but what is the institutional and political process that has allowed the government to get away with what I have just described. So the question completely becomes different. The question really is not how the state, but how the state got away with it. Perhaps the challenge to the authoritarian project, this is my proposition, perhaps the challenge to the authoritarian project and the defense of labor rights is a one integrated project. Asking this authoritarian state to craft a regulatory or a policy regime in favor of a labor is not a great start and need not be the focus of our research or part of our demand charter from the state. Time has come for labor studies people for a serious collective rethink on how to fight for labor right in these dark times. I thank the authors for the thought-provoking article and making me part of their conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I am a little worried now after listening to two stalwarts, and their take on the book. I thought, it's difficult to now say anything more, but let me try and put it in my way. I would like to start by thanking both the Gabeshana Chakra group and also the editors of the book for bringing together diverse entry to an issue like migration, as has been shared by the editor, that there are many people who are drawn from different segments, so it gives us a range of issues also. So let me come to the book directly and what I thought I should be looking at. I think the book is actually making an important contribution to the literature on migration. Because when we read, most of the books either are too conceptual or theoretical or only has empirical data, whereas this book combines everything. It has discussion, it gives a historical account, it also engages with social, economic and political changes, and also looks at labor laws and how state intervention is also an important factor in understanding migrant workers' experiences. So it actually then provides a kind of an integrated approach to look into studying migration. It looks at macro data, macro policy analysis, micro level ethnography, and field-based research. One of the issues that I find in many of the books on migration or papers on migration is that it looks at migration as a household or individual strategy, whereas this book takes a very different, most of the articles in the book take a different kind of entry point, which also talks about the structural inequalities of caste, class, and gender, and also regional disparities. So the book actually is anchored on these disparities, though it looks at some of those issues from an individual or a household point of view. I think one important merit of the book, which I think needs to be brought in the discussion, is that it goes beyond most of the binaries that we get stuck in our understanding of migration. Like we have free, unfree, We also have this, kind of distinction between voluntary, and also distressed, autonomous, independent. These are categories which we often use in our understanding and analysis of migration, which are limitations also most of the time. And here I would also like to bring in the fact that these categories are also an important constraints in terms of understanding female migration. So because one of the articles that Indrani Majumdar actually talks about as to how, whether it is a distress-driven migration or whether it's an autonomous migration, how do we actually look at within autonomous-driven migration distress? So, these binaries that we often, kind of take up in migration literature is also kind of nuanced in this book, which I think is a very important contribution to the book. Almost all the chapters actually highlight the need for more data, and I think that's something which which is an issue that people who are working on issues of migration, especially labor migration, has been highlighting. And it also talks about how the state has responded, or statistical organizations have responded to some of the existing demands that has been, or existing issues that has been flagged on data on migration. Here again, I think it's in the context of female labor migration, data remains an important issue. And one of the articles by Arpita actually flags the issue of not having any data. And even during the COVID, if you look at the media reports and all, we don't have actually enough evidence to talk about women. Even if the women appear, they are appearing as wives, as daughters, as carers. So their existence as labor migrants is something that is very important. And here I think the lack of data is an important issue. Some discussion has already been there in terms of how actually some of the initiatives that the state has now, or state is going ahead with, like skill development initiatives, and how these are designed to be anti-labor or pro-employer. And since women are seen as as a possible reserve for that kind of a cheap labor, how state actually mobilizes young women to make the labor cheap, and also to channelize the labor of poor women to locations elsewhere. And when we talk about independent autonomous migration, I think this is something that needs to be also looked at. And one of the articles by Indrani actually flags this issue. And some of the concerns that are specific to women and female labor migration appears, many of the articles which are there in the book. It also, if you look at the papers, most of the papers reiterates the importance of analyzing social capital and networks in migration studies. Though this is something that has been flagged by previous studies, it is important that to look at some of these concerns that the paper is raising, that the book is raising in terms of some of the papers, as to how are networks and social capital something that's given, or is it that it is also getting redefined, and how are these redefinition of some of the networks and social capital informing migration processes, or helping us to understand experiences of people who migrate. This is something that the book takes up, but it may need more more elaboration and more analysis. The book also highlights social security, social protection, and also looks at how the state fails to acknowledge the structural factors and why some of the measures are not functioning, though they may be in place. When the book actually, when many of the chapters in the book, when it talks about social security and social protection, there is a demand for simple documentation of various, whether it is IDs, alternative IDs and sources for access. But if you look at what is happening right now currently, is actually in the name of simplification, you are also bringing in more restrictions. Like, for example, in the context of Delhi, you have the pink cards now. and not all can access pink cards. Only if you have an Aadhaar card with Delhi residence address, you can access pink card. So who gets eliminated? How many migrants may have Aadhaar cards which has residences showing as Delhi? These are questions that are, I think, very important in the current context. Though one ration card is now on, but how many people use them, and what are the restrictions, what are the issues in terms of accessing these, and how are women within this? I know in the context of domestic workers, some of the migrant domestic workers that have studied in Delhi, getting a ration card is an issue, because for them they are not staying in the same residence for continuously for 6 months, continuously for 1 year, which is a requirement for you to get registered also. So there are issues with changing residences of migrants. How do migrants actually then negotiate these kinds of access to existing schemes and existing provisions? Let me come to the specific chapters on female migration, because I thought that is something that I am also working on. There are 2 dedicated chapters on migration, as Deepak Mishra has already shared. And I'm very happy that at least there are 2 chapters, and many chapters takes it up as issues. Female labor migration is actually a sidelined issue if you look at the literature on migration, especially labor migration. The book actually acknowledges the specific and increased vulnerabilities of women as both workers and as unpaid caregivers. Here again, I think the acknowledgement that women migrants labor, even if they are labor migrants, can't be only seen as workers, but also needs to be seen as unpaid carers, is something that I think the book is kind of pointing to, and I really congratulate the editors for bringing it out clearly in the book. What I thought was missing when I was looking at female migration, though there is in the introduction and also in some of the chapters, there is an acknowledgement that there are many tribal women who actually migrate to take up domestic work. Their experiences, their engagement, or how they were affected during the period of COVID and the pandemic, they may have a very different experience, because most of them are live-in workers. But that is not to say that there are not many domestic workers who are leave-out workers also. If you look at any city or urban center in Odisha, you have a lot of intrastate migrants who work as part-time leave-out workers. So what are their experiences? Because they are working in private households, their engagement with the employer is not even recognized many times. And how do they actually then negotiate? How did they negotiate? How different was it? And how were their engagement with COVID is something that I thought the book could have also highlighted, or may have a separate chapter on it. The book also provides a kind of a lens to the changes in the social fabric, which is very important, I think, because there are traditional social equations, whether it is caste, community, gender, but there are also changing. And these kinds of identities and equations actually order everyday work and everyday social life. But I'm sure with this many years of migration history that the region has, or the state has, there could be changes. If maybe that it is more fluid. Yeah, it's more fluid, and there are some redefinitions. But the book points to some of these, but doesn't actually engage with these fluidities and redefinitions in ways I thought could have given more to understanding gender relations and gender processes in migration. Because it talks about single women, it talks about stigma related to single women, and also the issues with trafficking laws, and why women are not many times counted in many of the labor laws, and why they are treated in terms of as women, not as workers. So I think these questions needs more engagement, but the book points to that direction, and I think there is scope now to engage with some of this more. The book also locates some of the newer forms of migration within this change redefines economic fabric, social and economic fabric. But when we look at from the women, from migration of women in this context, and when we talk about aspirations itself is a box. And I think it is important to understand aspirations within a context which is very important. What are their profiles? What are their backgrounds? How do they actually negotiate? What do they see themselves as? Why do they want? Why we term it as aspirations? How do we look at it? These are questions from the context of gender relations and women's labor migration, which are important. What is worrying, and I think this has already been shared, is that after so many years of research on migration and labor migration, we tend to come back to the same set of issues. So it is poverty, it's chronic poverty, it's not even poverty, it's chronic poverty, lack of employment, landlessness, indebtedness, vulnerability of debt. These are issues that still, and I'm sure, and we heard both Professor Ravi Srivastava and Professor Atul Sood. These are, we have failed as a group, as labor studies, as migration studies scholars. We have failed. Why is it that these research is not informing, or why is it that there is no political interest in terms of changing the lives of migrants and changing the lives of people who are already marginalized? These are questions that I think remains with us, and the fact that after pandemic people have gone back now, not in the same terms and conditions, in fact worse terms and conditions. So that's something I think which is important for us to look at. I think for future, I just will flag for one or two issues. I think the intrastate migration is also very important in the context of Odisha, so which doesn't find much discussion in the book. And also associational and family migration. It talks about associational and family migration in the context of migrants to Surat and to some of these locations. But we, more than an acknowledgement of that, that's important to understand how the labor of women and girls especially not only support the labor force, in the given place of destination that they are, but also kind of are part of a social reproduction process, and how capitalist system is actually, or the particular industry to which they are moving, how actually the cheap labor, how they are able to then provide for the cheap labor. So I think that's an important thing. And the left behind story, because I was, when anyone who is interested in female migration, it's also important the women workers issues and women issues of women and social change. I think it's important to also look at left behind women. And there are many more studies on this question, but these are issues that I thought can be. And last is about the migrants' relations with source areas, because in the context of the pandemic, it was people have gone back. What are their relations with families back? How are migrant families there, members there, looking at migrants' return, and what does it mean for their immediate and larger families? The kind of tensions or kind of fluidity that they must have had is something which is very important also and especially when they are going back to these villages without much income or no income. So what is this kind of, and I'm sure some of these are wishes and of a reader, and I hope some books in the future could cover some of these dimensions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm not an academic and I've never spoken at a book launch before. But when the legend Manoranjan Mohanty asked me to be here, I didn't think I could say no. As I read the book, I was struck by two things. Long years ago, being a student of the social sciences and reading critiques of area studies, and it struck me that this is an advance from there in terms of studying a region and a particular issue in that region, but within the larger context of the political economy it exists in, and of course the history. So it's in a way a progressive contribution to area studies. I also found the chapters on migration useful insofar as there was an attempt, which is not normally made, to actually understand what lives of migrants and how different they are when they come into the towns and the cities. And I think both papers, one referencing, or three in fact, one on the hawkers in Telangana, the other on workers in Surat, and the third in the garment industries of southern India, were a reflection of what kind of challenges migrants face. Of course, between the paper on Telangana, between the paper on Telangana and the one on extrapholism, give us some idea of how resources are transferred. But in a state like Odisha, I think I would certainly have wanted to know two things. One, what's the scale of transfers that are taking place or have taken place? And second, I couldn't find anything that refers to workers who in the first instance were displaced for extractive industries and then found themselves in the crossfire of COVID. To me, whether we have not traveled further in welfare of workers, and be they any workers, from COVID to now is signaled by the fact that the short blip in which we had higher LPG prices, we saw quite a sharp rise in returning migrant workers from many Indian cities. Of course, the numbers were smaller, the stories were less dark because they were actually traveling by bus and train. But the fact that happened is a good signal to how little has moved or little has changed and little has improved. Which really brings me to a question of the recommendations of the book. And I think the recommendations of the book are in line with the general discussion around the table on what happens to workers from what we learned from COVID, etc., etc. I have a younger, brasher woman colleague who, when someone in the room starts asking about what's our stand on migrant workers, what do we do on migrant workers, her answer is, we should also discuss giraffes. Her point being that we cannot endlessly engage in the differentiation of workers. And this is the history of the relationship between the Indian state and labor for 70 years, that there has been a constant differentiation of workers by category across the board. Workers, at the end of the day, are workers, irrespective of where they come from. Many who we see as resident workers are only one generation migrant. The sheer scale of migration that takes place in the country suggests that, there are way more migrant workers than we recognize. And while it might be useful for state governments to build registers of migrant workers to ensure that they're protected, the idea that we have separate laws for migrant workers, and we have separate laws for mine workers, and we have separate laws for journalists, and so on and so forth, actually divides the class. Now, the history of labor jurisprudence is, as miners led their agitation in the late 19th and early 20th century, a mining workers' law came on. So on, a plantation work came on in the 1940s and 50s. But in much of the world, where we learned collectively through the struggles of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, there is only one law, and that's the employment law. There is only one class of worker. irrespective of the so-called color of his or her shirt. And I think this is a crucial difference we need to move to today. And I'm a minority in my own organization on this, because construction workers' unions say, no, we need a separate law. And domestic workers' unions say, we need a separate law. And each of them attaches a whole phraseology of comprehensive law and says that the nature of work is different, the nature of employment is different. I mean, as I joke in my own organization, on a particular day in a city, you could have our construction workers' union marching for health and safety on one street, and on a parallel street, domestic workers belonging to the same national organization marching for the minimum wage, and never that twain shall meet. So the point I'm making is that we have to actually move, if we're talking about rights, we have to actually move from very specific rights to a generalized right of working people, a generalized right of employment. And I want to say this in the context of a society that's divided enormously by gender, but by caste too. Every workplace, however modern in our country, is stratified by caste. We have a whole notion of staff and workers, people who work with their hands and people who don't work with their hands. When we meet our fraternity abroad, they're all workers, they're not outside leaders like I am. Why is that the case? Because everybody apart from a handful of people, which is the CEO and a bunch of personnel managers, are all union members. So all categories of skill, all categories of education, all categories of life experience are present in the union to take it forward as a collective. And I think this, to me, is a fundamental question of actually moving to a common right, to a common understanding. I was briefly a member of a committee at the fag end of the Congress government to deal with contract labor. And my colleague from the INTUC said, अच्छा ठीक है, आप लाल कार्ड दे दीजिए तो फिर कोई contract labor का समस्या नहीं है. So give contract workers a handout, and then we don't have to worry about any of their other rights, because they will get cheap price. I mean, somewhere this entire culture has to break, which in fact brings me to the question of what Atul said, whether it's a right or an entitlement, and what is the welfarist function. I'm going to finally turn to a question that came up during the CJP. There was a clamor about the silence of big-name film actors keeping quiet. No one asked an industrialist to speak. Not one industrialist spoke. They say they need high-skilled workers. They're the ones who complain about the quality of skills, the quality of education. But there's one thing they don't complain about, and that's wages. This entire model that we're faced with today, the underbelly of which is the migrant worker, is the model that the state has put at disposal of capital, a model of suppressed wages. There's an entire transmission mechanism of moving workers from one part of a country to another. I mean, if one goes back to the 1920s data, we were still a labor surplus economy. But the effort of the imperial government was to move workers to get its task done, get them to port, get them to work regularly. Today is to flood the urban labor market so as to ensure that wages are kept down, Collective action is kept down. Any kind of solidarity is broken. Because if you're getting 12,000 rupees a month, I'm there to undercut you and take 11.5. And today our crisis, the crisis of the working class is that the state has pushed the working class into a framework. Look at what workers in Noida were saying. 1-2 aur de denge to theek hai. In a way, that's all they ask. We've calculated that at today's prices, 45,000 rupees is the minimum that one can earn to reproduce yourself. And I mean that not just in a biological sense, but also in a social sense. So, the DMK, in its election campaign, in its manifesto, I will be done, in its election manifesto said it had created, literally gave a very precise number, 500,000 manufacturing jobs in Tamil Nadu in the 5 years that they were in government. That number is perhaps correct. If anyone sees what's happening in Tamil Nadu in terms of industrial expansion, you can believe that they created 500,000. The point is, you will with difficulty find 5 people who earn more than 15,000 rupees out of that 500,000. That is about suppressed wages. In that tract where that 500,000 workers work, you will not find one union that is a modicum of a fighting union that's independent of employer or political party. Because there is fear that I'll be replaced, and I've traveled all the way from Odisha, and I'll be replaced by a Bengali. So, I mean, I think we need a very fundamental change. We need a very fundamental change in the way the labor movement unionizes. But I think we also need a fundamental change within academia and civil society as to how we move, how we look at our categories, and how we see movement on the ground, and how that, in fact, we are in some ways also fetters to thinking differently. That said, I welcome this contribution. To me, as a trade unionist, every contribution of this kind is education, and I read this with great care, learned, and I will continue to learn. Thank you for asking me to be here.
Thank you so much. Challenging perspective. Finally, Biswajit.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty and Professor Deepak Mishra, for giving me an opportunity to speak on this topic, which is very contemporary, and people are grappling with these issues. And I'm slightly nervous because whatever I had come to speak on has already been spoken. Then what more should I speak? Let me try to speak something different that I read of this book. A book's significance lies and its relevance are measured by 2 gold standards. The first is that the book scores on both counts. And the first text is when it compels persons to recollect past memories and rethink about the issues differently. That is the first hallmark of a book, that it forces you to think differently and recollect some of the issues that you have encountered in your past memory. I'll just recollect one such issue. When I was going through this book, I recollected one of these issues. We stated that when I was a child, there are people from Bhadrak, we call them Bhadrakiyas in Odia. So they used to come to our place to lay bricks, and they burn bricks, they keep them in our field, subsequently to be for our houses to be reconstructed. And that allowed me to think, if the book is dealing with such kind of issues, of course that is dealing with the history of migration, and Professor Vidyut Mohanty's history of looking at migration from the famine time. And that also helped me to understand, and the stories that I had learned from my grandparents about how they used to cope with this famine, that gave me an interest more to look into the book. What is the pattern of migration? And Professor Vidyut Mohanty's pattern of migration has been carried out by Professor Udaya Rajan, who says that pattern is continuing, is the caste pattern of migration that is continuing the same. OBCs are going more in number than others. But subsequently, things have changed. When I go back to my village, I find the paddy fields are being harvested by tribes coming from different parts of Odisha. And that gives an intra-district migration pattern that I can see. The contractors are there, and the contractors are bringing those tribals from Kalahandi and all those areas to be employed in this paddy field. That is seasonal migration. So that book gave me a kind of prism through which I can look into my past. So that is one of the best book, that the hallmark of the best book is this. The second, it provides an in-depth and nuanced analysis of the current situation that helps scholars of similar interest to get an informed understanding of a phenomena. That is an interesting thing. Why? On this count, the book is scholarly contribution to the existing scattered literature on grassroots perspective of Odisha's political economy and especially on migration. If you look at Odisha's literary history, especially from a grassroots perspective, you'll find very few books that have been written on this. And this pattern started with the Odisha Gabeshana Chakra, as Professor Mohanty started that in 1980s. That brought all the scholars from Odisha, those who are working at the grassroots level, not only the scholars, but also the activists. They came together to this forum. And many theoretical issues has been discussed in this book. Getting that perspective of grassroots or the person from margin, right? The marginal perspective has been found out, can be found in this book. So what happens is that very few books, Professor Mohanty's the first book, Why is Odisha Poor, gives a perspective of caste dominance in Odisha, right? So domination. Then Professor Deepak Mishra's book, recent book, 2026 book, India, Odisha at 100, right? Professor Vidyut Mohanty's book. Likewise, Ranjana Padhi's book, Vijay Upadhyay's book. Those are very few books. And this book is a major contribution in this sense to Odisha's political economy and understanding from the very grassroots perspective. So this book provides a nuanced understanding of migration and explores multidimensional aspect of this phenomenon. Theoretically, the book has taken structuralist perspective and focuses on extractive capitalism that connects different aspects of migration. Hypotheses have been tested. The local has been connected to the wider dimension of extraction of surplus or rent. Two important chapters, one by Professor Samal and another on Telangana. These two chapters provide this hypothesis have been tested in this. And the political aspect of migration is broadly captured through the discussion of politics of extractive capitalism. However, what I perceive is that politics of extractive capitalism does not fully capture why of migration and multidimensional aspect of migration. There is something more to it than just extraction. So here, I would say I agree with Professor Sood, is that what should have been the center has been taken to the appendix. That means I look at this whole book from a different perspective, though there is subtext to that, subtext that runs through this book. So what is that? Let me elaborate on that. I'd argue that a subtext of another kind of politics runs through the chapters. The chapters are linked through a lack. What is that lack? The lack of citizenship status for some. And citizenship becomes a prism to address the political. And what is the nexus between citizenship and migration? Two characteristics of citizenship unravel the nexus between citizenship and migration. First, citizenship status is crucial for migration opportunities. And second, political and economic contestation over migration affect the mobility of citizens. These are two important aspects of citizenship. Through this, we can connect the relationship between citizenship and migration. Let me elaborate on this too. So, citizenship is a person who has the right to have a right. The right to have a right. This is famously stated by Hannah Arendt in her book. This means that, at least discursively, the notion is associated with equality of having political, social, economic, and cultural rights within the nation state. Citizenship has 4 dimensions: membership, legal status, rights, and participation. As members of a community within the nation state, citizens enjoy equal legal status. In India, equality is provided under right to equality in the 14 to 18 article, and especially Article 19D, E, and G, they are important aspects of this. So, in the nutty place where the migrants are moving from one place to another, the class, caste, and gender aspect of law implementation makes some less equal citizens than others. The inter-community disharmony, unequal status and relation among different castes, lack of local control over natural resources like jal, jungle, jamin by tribes, and gender discrimination over distribution of resources within and outside the community propel people to move from place for habitual residence to a destination state. So migration is not just a product of economic pull and push, but also a product of unequal citizenship status. So that's how the unequal citizenship status at a particular given point of time and place forces you to become a migrant, right? In addition to this extractive capitalism that you are talking about. And the unequal citizenship status propels citizens to retain the drivers of mobility aspiration high and seek opportunities to earn a decent living within and outside the states and the country. That has been highlighted throughout the book, how this lack of citizenship that creates a kind of aspiration among the migrants and they seek opportunity outside. So that is an important aspect of why citizenship is important. Apart from the legal status and membership, or what is called politics of recognition, there are 2 other dimensions of citizenship. They are rights and participation. They are commonly considered as politics of redistribution and politics of representation. How resources are redistributed and how these migrants, whether the migrants find any kind of representation in the decision-making process or not. That becomes an important point of consideration. And these dimensions are struggles for realization of substantive citizenship. That's what Professor Atul mentioned, and also Gautam also mentioned. So, citizenship rights basically encompasses political, social, economic, and cultural rights. These rights are significant for the migrants to stay protected at the destination states. The migrants are discriminated against in many Indian states. Discrimination between the native and the migrants that we have seen in not only in Delhi but also in Maharashtra, right? That we are constantly witnessing that. A Marathi, you have to speak in Maratha language, 4 months of training, all these are creating problems. And because of this unequal citizenship status that is being given to these migrants. So in this context, the interstate migrants fall victim to many kinds of illegitimate unfair practices. In the destination state, migrants fall victims to unscrupulous employers who exploit them with impunity. And these are mentioned in these topics, the chapters in your book. Many instances highlight that opportunity to move from place of residence to destination is facilitated, but return home is restricted. The unequal status prevails. You can move out, but you can be restricted. That means in brick lane areas and many other places, this is true. And this has been highlighted adequately by the chapters in this book. So it has become a normal practice to blame the migrants of committing crime, accusing them of being burden on resources of the state, crowding of public spaces. Now you have discussion on whether who is crowding this public space, right to work. So whether these vendors, they are creating problem or not. Yes. So the political, even blaming them for promoting vote bank politics. The political strategy is to create a wedge between helpless citizens and privileged members of a community, both within and outside the state. This degrades the status of migrants and creates conditions for leading a subhuman life in cities as well as in rural areas. In this sense, citizens become strangers. They are strangers whose life is dependent on state's policy towards them. Many times, due to these policies, migrants enter into necropolitical sphere. So the stranger becomes an objective criterion to understand functioning of democracy and well-being of economy. Strangers or movement of migrants become an important yardstick to gauge the health of economy. A robust democracy is a condition where the strangers and natives live together peacefully and harmoniously. And this book helps us to understand political economy of Odisha in this strange sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we had a fantastic set of contributions, and I will not even summarize them now. I was looking at, I didn't stop anybody. I'm looking at the time. I think by 5 o'clock they will ask us to leave. It was 2 to 5 the room was allotted to us, but we will not leave unless we are forced out. So we will have some discussion, responses, and so we have time. Because you had some really provocative comments and very important contributions. Unequal citizenship. Differentiation has, how it has really destroyed the possibility of our intervention. The citizenship and labor rights, which Biswajit took in the political direction very firmly, was formulated as a very integrated concept here, and in a very interesting way as a critic of labor studies. And Ravi Srivastava, the expert on the subject, very carefully showed us where our loopholes still remain in understanding as well as in policy. So we have and the very softly but very firmly, how some issues are taken up and some are missed. For example, the most striking point I would carry from Neetha's presentation is that yes, family migration takes place, but you only count those who are working as migrant labor in some either manufacture or something. But what about other things that they are doing? The totality of labor of women in that family, the girls particularly, our framework doesn't take that into account. So we have really a whole set of challenging issues, and I think this afternoon the field of labor studies has been enriched thanks to all of you. Thank you. Okay, now I hope I have given you some break to think and raise questions. Who will start? Somebody has to start? Yes. You come up here or give him a mic. Yeah.
Okay, sir. Good afternoon. I am Dr. Balakrishna. Actually, I am assistant professor at BITS Planning. So first of all, thanks to Deepak sir for giving me an opportunity to contribute one chapter in this particular book. So again, thanks for this wonderful discussion today by all the experts, subject experts here on migration, development, linking to the earlier, let's say, thinking about from the history to the political economy of migration and how we're going to discuss this thing particularly. So the major problem, as you have mentioned, that we found during COVID-19 crisis, that government is looking for migration data. And unfortunately, after 2007 and 8, we don't have any migration survey. And last month only government in July 2026 started the migration survey, which again we expected to get in the next year mostly. And second, also look about the major issues relating to the analyzing migration data is about the numbers, how to get that, because unless and until you're not going to get those numbers, how can you able to make certain policies for that? And the another data set which is available relating to that is related to the census. And unfortunately, we don't have still 2021 census. And most of our policies again depend still on 2011 data only. Any surveys we are doing to do. So on those aspects, again, lot of things need to be discussed further. And many of the studies nowadays are only looking into the primary survey for analyzing the migration, development, disparity, issues related to gender, and so on. So one of the recent study we are doing along with Professor Ravi and Professor Binoz Abraham on this platform work, informality and gender aspect. One of the major aspect also we are looking into migration into that. So interestingly, we are finding that, and we are doing this study again currently going on this platform workers, specifically in Delhi, Mumbai, Hyderabad, Bangalore, then Mysore, Ranchi. And here, interestingly, we are finding what's particularly nowadays you can find this pronto and snabit workers. And during the survey only, and now the survey is going on, one of the interesting factors finding broadly the migrant workers, female workers, those are coming to do snabit and the pronto kind of services, they are much more vulnerable because they have to work for 12 hours per day and they can go from inside a boundary and there is a particular boss is there who is looking after all the time. So, and they are also going to get a lot of penalties. So what kind of, let's say, policies are going to bring particularly to these platform workers? Because in India per se, you don't have any laws particularly related to the platform workers as brought it out. Except few states are done it relating to your Rajasthan, Ranchi, your Telangana and few others. So what kind of new policy you're going to bring in particularly to the platform migrant workers? How to address the dual citizenship? Now we're going to discuss about you should know a particular, let's say, language if you would like to work in any other state. So how to link in this?
Do you have any question to any of the panelists?
So relating to this data observations, that is my major aspect.
Okay.
Just thought to add a few more things there. So, thank you.
On the data. Okay, any other? Yes, please. Skylab.
Thank you very much for the
Another contributor.
discussions that we had. I actually had a lot of nuances to learn. While saying that, I have a question to Atul Sood, especially your intriguing, the points that you made. They are very, very, prudent and they are important to be taken up. However, while saying that, when we talk about a social democratic state, or for that matter, a neoliberal state or in a liberal state, basically we are not, kind of demystifying the role of the state. Rather, what we are doing, we are asking the state to be either more socialist or democratically socialist. And in that way, I think to demand for rights is possible. And in that way, the state may not be the giver, or the state may not be the only in a position of guardian. Rather, the state, has to be operating within the constitutional parameter. And also, the constitution again is not a static thing. Rather, again, there could be people or collective which can demand, taking from your, kind of point, I think there is a need to build better collective. So that the need for, putting forth more rights or rights in a particular manner could be negotiated with the state in a better manner, again taking from Gautam sir's point of view, so that the rights discourse could be reset to ensure that rights of the people are because if we are not thinking about a totally a socialist or a Marxist, kind of arrangement where we are thinking of challenging the state to, to break down it. In that case, I think there is a new way of looking at it and think how to build the resistance in such a way that it remains democratic and the state doesn't remain in a position just to give as a giver. Rather, it has to be a duty of the state to provide that entitlement. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? No? All right. I think I'll ask a couple of questions to the panel. To Gautam Mody, I think on the differentiation issue, I mean, why we need class organization in a complex way, class mobilization of workers in a complex way, and that complexity has to take into account caste and gender, caste, ethnicity and gender. I was, for 5 years, I was helping set up a Workers' Development Institute, and I did not succeed. After 5 years in Raurkela, I resigned and came back. And every day we were witnessing in front of our institute in that whole area. I mean, I don't want to spend time on that. I mean, that hour when we were studying unorganized workers of Raurkela, Nirmal Sengupta, myself mainly, and that these were Adivasi, that too several kinds of other tribes from different parts of that whole region. So the and some poor OBCs, tribals, Dalits, and then the women, tribal workers, women Dalit workers in certain jobs and so on. I think my Raurkela experience convinced me that a complex class organization has to be conceptualized, incorporating the ethnic, caste, gender and regional specificities. And that's why, you have differentiated workers' organizations. But there are two kinds of differentiation. One that state and capital do to divide workers very purposely and make them fight against one another. Another that workers' politics should envisage by having solidarities and differentiation built into the organization mode. So I would like you to respond to that. Now, Atul, I completely shared the perspective. I just told him that's like a PUDR scholar, which I consider my aspiration to be. And first time during those Raurkela days, in fact, in 1980, we had the first PUDR fact-finding to Dalli Rajhara. The Chhattisgarh Mine Shramik Sangh demonstration was fired upon, and that's when we first examined Sumanta Banerjee, Bharat Dogra, Subara, Sudesh, me, we were in that group. And first time one seriously looked at this problem. I still did not continue my intellectual attention to that so much, but I tried to understand. And I think Shankar Guhan Yogi understood that how it is important to integrate organized and unorganized together. yet emphasize how this neglected sector of unorganized workers needed special attention. So, that act was used, but Chhattisgarh Mine Shramik Sangh was organizing both together, organized mining workers as well as unorganized mining workers, and also steel plant workers. Therefore, Atul, the citizenship rights, in fact, I would say reduce the scope of workers' rights, because citizenship rights, have the danger of, it should not. Our concept of citizen is such a politically powerful, political economy concept. But the liberal theory of citizenship will give you just civil rights, not democratic rights. And we would like, the concept of democratic rights to combine both civil liberties and democratic rights. And that is why, while talking about citizenship rights, you have to go a step further and give your definition of the citizenship. Otherwise, the reason we split with PUCL was precisely this. They had a very, limited concept of civil rights and citizenship. So that is the only qualification I would make. Now to our, one is always guided by Ravi Srivastava's writings on this subject. I have felt that they have been too charitable to the state as well as the trade union movement. I think all of us have been too charitable. We have this wish list. I like that criticism though. But I also agree with Skylab that I think we have to keep on demanding the state. Sure. We have to organize politics to demand the state to do that.
Yes, absolutely.
Otherwise, they will only talk about kartabya path, kartabya, everything, and not rights. I have a small piece on that. The Hakdar versus the what is beneficiary in Hindi? Lavarthi. Okay. Now, I think we have to. What the experts have done beautifully is have exposed the limits of informalization. And the dangers and how it does precarity and all that. But how the whole system is in that direction. This flexibilization, the neoliberal economy, and if that is the trend, what should be the alternative political economy response from the trade unions, workers, and labor studies? I think we don't have a framework on that yet. And finally, and this is a question to both Atul as well as Neetha. You see, in the Hindutva authoritarian or Hindutva fascism project, there is a very interesting effort of the patrimonial support, that we have the resources to take care of all the crises. So the universal basic income translated into, for all risks, for example, free ration, PM Awas Yojana, PM this, PM that. In other words, and My complaint is that in the name of demanding the state to concede the rights, there has not been adequate critique of all these Lakshmi Yojana, this Yojana, that Yojana, by the feminist movement. I think one has to give a powerful critique of this kind of welfareism, and what should be a political answer from the workers' perspective to fascism, because fascism is selling itself in such a patrimonial, what we call patrimonial welfarist way. Most of the common people are disarmed. I mean, they think that there is a caring state, caring. So this is not fascism. This is a caring state. How do we confront that? Even to Biswajit, I have a question. I think the grassroots perspective is not grassroots enough. That is my complaint in Gabeshana Chakra and to you also. That I think we tried, for example, to know the panchayat views from the sarpanches and the ward members. We are not able to even talk to them enough. I think the scholars who meet, I'm disappointed, they are not doing enough grassroots work, enough. I think they are in this survey method framework, and survey method and grassroots politics or grassroots research, participant observation research and the struggle research is very different. I think one has to be critical of that also. Okay, 2 minutes each. Anybody else is now provoked to add anything? Okay, now shall we go in the reverse order? Biswajit.
Yes, I didn't have much time to elaborate on this grassroots perspective because what is happening is that whenever the political scientists are talking about what is called survey research, election studies, they are talking about not the participation of the interviewee, rather they are taking a broad picture of what is happening, a macro picture. So when talking about micro picture, as this book is talking about, even then also the micro picture has not come out properly. Of course, it's a broad-based thing, and it's a bottom-up approach. Bottom-up approach also means that you have to stay grounded. And staying grounded means that you have to talk about, you have to be with labor, what is called, Gramsci calls organic labor, or organic intellectual. You have to be there with the labor, you have to organize them as well and become part of it. Very few political scientists have done that. So that's why I say that your perspective or Professor Deepak Mishra's perspective is that you have tried to be with them. And organizing these seminars also gives you a kind of window where you can interact with those people and create a theoretical understanding out of that.
Okay.
So that becomes a grassroots perspective.
Thank you. Gautam.
My reference to universality was restricted to our ask of the state. We shouldn't leave the state to differentiate between different categories of worker and natures of employment, which is what actually one looks back at the history divides us by jurisdiction and by jurisprudence, which is something which the Indian state has made a fine art out of. I completely agree that a workers' organization has to be a complex creature. It has to be a creature that accommodates every form of identity and every form of economic and social origin, that has to be imbued in a notion of solidarity. Without solidarity, no workers' organization is of meaning, and I think we should be very clear about it. When it's permanent workers who don't organize contract workers, to me that's a wage shop. That is not a trade. That is not a fighting workers union. They're just fighting for wages for one section. They're a lobby group. They're not a trade union in how I think most of us would see it.
Thank you. Atul. Quick 3 points.
Sorry.
Neetha.
Okay. Since we are, yeah.
Neetha, go ahead.
Yeah, Neetha.
That's the order we're going.
So, the question that you raised, that there has not been enough or powerful critique of some of the schemes and programs for girls and women, I think I agree with it. But it also has to be looked at as to how the state has kind of schemed it in a sense, pushed it in a sense. The fact that it is some of this are very populistic, and some of the interventions are also rooted in the Hindutva context, but also rooted in the cultural and making the Indian culture and the traditions, women's role as in traditional societies. It is difficult also to kind of intervene in such cases because of that's why women's movements and feminists are struggling as to how you actually look at it at the grassroots level. Even the populist measures like wages for housework, this came in the last few years. It seemingly looks like a very progressive thing, but what it actually does to women, is that women are then kind of trapped in their traditional roles as housewives or as these are questions, and I think there is the need to engage with some of these questions more than what we see, how we look at it right now.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking those questions. Professor Sahu, your point about engaging with the state, fair enough. Of course, we have to engage with the state. My only small observation was that if you look at the list, this is the last point about how to organize migrant labor. And then there are 15 or 20 other things. Probably if we start from this vantage point of organizing labor and then ask what questions we should need to ask the state, I think the consideration will become very different. That's my just humble submission. Your point is also well taken that there would be grades of research and people will have different engagement with the state. But when I made those observations, I had this in my mind that we have at least fair bit of people in this room who are probably wanting to engage with the question of labor studies with the larger vantage point that contributes to the overthrowing of the state, and I don't hesitate in saying that. On the question of what Professor Mohanty was asking, we had 2 Gen Z movements in the last 3 months. One in Jantar Mantar, but we have forgotten the Noida Manesar. That exactly was Gen Z. I did some amount of field work and wrote about it. All the people who were there, who protested, were in that age group. Look at the dynamics and how it unfolded differently. So it is the onus of the labor studies and the scholars engaged with the labor question to examine this. What is that makes that distinction? The kind of linkages that were expected from the Gen Z movement of April is different from the kind of linkages that we are expecting from the Gen Z movement of the month of July and August. And I think all I was pushing for us to consider was how could we actually contribute to that process. And I think there is much to learn. I confess that I felt very inadequate when I went around meeting the workers to the limited extent I could meet and ask and answer their questions that they were asking about their conditions of work. I thought that the scholarship that we have done is really inadequate to address the questions that they were asking. So it is in that spirit that I had said, this is not a complete critique of everything that we do, but I do think that the larger goal that we have in mind, perhaps we need to reconsider. Last point about the state. We do say that it's a neoliberal state, and we say it in the same breath. There's enough literature to argue that this neoliberal state has mutated Whatever this state is, I don't want to go into the debate of nomenclature, but it is a mutated neoliberal state. And the authoritarian project is of a very different order. And therefore, the issue of the authoritarian project and how labor is engaged with that authoritarian project, to me, becomes a fundamental project. They cannot be two distinct projects. And how do we do it? I really don't have an answer. But we haven't really asked that question enough. And my humble request was, perhaps we start looking at it more carefully or in greater detail. That's all I was saying. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay.
I mean, I don't know whether I'm directly answering your question, but I'll connect up with also with what Bala was asking about data and the lack of data. Basically, my view is that neoliberal capital has flexibilization at the core strategy. And flexibilization has three main, as it were, anchors or pillars. One is informalization. The other is segmentation of the workforce in multiple ways. And the third is migration. So these three are really central to the core strategy of neoliberal capital vis-a-vis flexibilization. Now, because this core strategy underpins everything which capital does, but at the same time, this core strategy is not something which capital is out there to measure. So you find very little concrete evidence or concrete, this thing of either segmentation or informalization or migration. And in 2020, we saw the affidavit which was filed by the government of India before the Supreme Court. And it was, how much nonsense the government of India could possibly put. So that is the case. Now, given the fact that this is the strategy which capital has, this strategy will obviously also divides labor. As it segments labor, as it does other things, it divides labor. But it is the job of people, not only academics, but people who are out there on the field, to basically build wider labor solidarities. And that's a very important area. There I completely agree with Gautam that, I don't know whether one can begin with the precept of having one solidarity, because that would go against the very logic of capital just now, which is working in the other way. But building these solidarities or these larger solidarities is something certainly a task which we need to put before ourselves.
Thank you very much. I think you should say something, Deepak, and then Amit will give the vote of thanks. Come.
Well, I can only thank the panelists for raising the issues which are relevant not only in this context of this book, but in the general context of understanding labor in our contemporary political economy of development in India. Now, I would like to respond to the important question that Atul raised, which is a very legitimate critique of the way we were approaching. But at the same time, I think after the clarifications, I think it is very clear that all of us understand that there is a long gap between where we are standing today and where we want to be vis-a-vis the nature of the state and the nature of rights. So there is a great deal of agreement there. Having said that, I would just like to share the process through which this document comes up. So when we are talking with a cross-section of people, and these documents were, although it was, the few names appear on behalf of the organization, this was basically a compilation of the aspirations of people. And these very small economic, and let's remember that this is going on during the process of COVID. So people are desperate, and in that process of surviving difficult days, working classes also have very mundane small demands which ultimately, I agree with your point, that which ultimately plays to the games of the management of dissent in a democracy like ours. But then these issues are also important for, like one cannot blame the workers for asking too little when they are struggling against such overwhelming oppositional force. So in that sense, there needs to be a conversation around how to bridge the gap between these seemingly small incremental economistic demands and the larger questions of structural change that we can all hope for. Thank you.
Okay. That was the defense of that appendix. Amit, the publisher, Amit Saxena. Usually we say his father,
Yeah.
It's not here. This is the future of Akar.
Good evening, everyone. It is my privilege to deliver the vote of thanks on this memorable occasion, marking the discussion of Workers on Road, the India story from Odisha. On behalf of Akar Books, I would like to extend my heartfelt thanks to our distinguished panelists, Professor Ravi Srivastava, Professor Atul Sood, Mr. Gautam Mody, Professor Neetha, and Professor Biswajit Mohanty for their insightful and thought-provoking remarks. Their perspectives have added greatly to our understanding of the book and the issues it raises. I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to Professor Manoranjan Mohanty for chairing the session and guiding the discussion so thoughtfully. Our heartfelt thanks goes to the editors of the book, Professor Deepak Mishra and Professor Swarnamayee Tripathy, as well as all the contributors for placing their trust in Akar Books and giving us the opportunity to bring this important work to readers. Finally, I would like to thank all our distinguished guests, friends, colleagues, and everyone who has joined us today. Your presence and participation has made this occasion truly special and meaningful. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much. Thank you.